In this episode, I talk about how to financially handle a layoff, getting yourself an accountability partner, how to intensely focus on paying off debt, and what a Trump presidency means for the housing market.
I go beyond the philosophy, and I give you real life application. I am Coach Nino Villa.
Hey everybody, and welcome to episode number 4 of the Ask Coach Nino Villa show. I want to start this episode off with a little State of the Union address, if you will. As many of you may know, I have a regular 9-to-5 job, and I do financial coaching on the side. I do these videos in my spare time. Well, all of that has changed over the course of the last week, and I no longer have a normal 9-to-5 job. And while I should be really concerned about that, or that should be really scary, it's not. You know, my faith is firmly rested in God's hands. I know God will provide. And He used my old 9-to-5 to be the vessel that provided financially for my family. And now He'll use a different vessel, whether that is coaching full-time or whether that is finding another 9-to-5 employer. My wife and I, we are very excited about this opportunity. And of course, it comes with a little bit of concern here or there. But all in all, for the most part, we are really excited about what lies ahead. And so it means, really putting into practice a lot of the things that I talk about when I talk about how to handle finances. Obviously, we're putting a lot of those things into practice, but now there's a different sort of approach when the 9-to-5 comes to an end. And I wanted to start the show off addressing a little bit about how a situation changes once you may find yourself either at the end of a layoff, or maybe you decide to quit an organization. But when the normal 9-to-5 income comes to a halt, I wanted to talk about what happens then. And so one of the first things is, considering we're still in baby step number 2 of Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover, it means we're trying to get out of debt. Well, when the income changes and when things are a little bit uncertain, the very first thing you do is you pause the debt snowball. Pause. So what's going to happen from here on out? We'll make minimum monthly payments on the debts that we have, which at this point, we have our mortgage, we have our second mortgage, and we have student loans. And so it's about paying the minimums and not trying to pay anything aggressively while we're kind of in flux, in transition. And so in all actuality, one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to reach out to our student loan service providers, and I'm going to get a financial hardship deferment right now. So again, with the uncertainty and the transition and just not knowing if I have the ability to put these loans into deferment, I should do that for a very short period of time while I figure out what this transition looks like. Now, that does mean I'm going to accrue more interest and whatnot, but taking care of the mortgage and putting food on the table and those certain things are more important. And so while things are kind of up in the air and again, uncertain for the time being, that is a financial decision I'm willing to make, is put both my wife's and my student loans in a hardship deferment until our income becomes normalized again, so that I can continue to pay the mortgage and the second mortgage, and then start hitting those hard again once things settle in. And so, like I said, the first thing to do is stop paying extra on debt. And so what are we going to do with any extra money? Any extra money is going to just be thrown at our emergency fund. Our emergency fund will help us to maintain over the course of the next 3 or 4 months. So if you saw last week's episode, I talked about if you're somebody who works on tips, or you work on commission, or you work for yourself as an entrepreneur, self-proprietor, I talked about putting yourself on a salary, and that's exactly what we're going to do out of the emergency the emergency fund. So I am practicing exactly what I preached last week, which is we're looking at what are our monthly expenses and what do our monthly expenses not exceed? There's got to be a number that they don't exceed. And for us, it's $3,000. Our monthly expenses do not exceed $3,000. And so it's about putting myself on a salary from the emergency fund of no more than $3,000 a month. And so really we're just going to be working off of the assumption of $800 a week, which actually puts us at $3,200 for the month, right? $800, $1,600, $2,400, and then $3,200 for the month. And the way I came up with that number is not only did we look at our monthly expenses, but I always talk about I remember my dad said, son, make in 1 week what your rent or mortgage is for the month. So our mortgage payment is $780 a month. Let's just round that up to $800. And so I'm paying myself $800 a week, $3,200 a month. And we're going to make all of our expenses work off of that. And based off of those numbers, we should be okay for 3 or 4 months while I'm working diligently to grow this coaching side gig, or to replace any 9 to 5, or if that's not what God has for me and he wants me to find employment with another employer, well, I'll be doing things to actively seek employment as well. So I just wanted to start the show off with a little State of the Union address. Like I said, kind of give you an update as to where we are, and more importantly, illustrate through a very practical example how the financial situation changes when employment situations change. And so there it is, the employment situation changes. We now turn our focus to pressing pause on the debt snowball. Any income that we do have is going to go into the emergency fund, and the emergency fund is going to be our source of income for the next 3 or 4 months as we pay ourselves a salary of $800 a week. And so, like I said, that ties right into what I mentioned last week about putting yourself on the salary if you work for tips, if you work for a commission, or if you're a self-proprietor, self-employed type of person. So let's get into the rest of the show.
Bobby asks, how is the budget communicated and adhered to during the month?
Okay, Bobby. So once you have a budget in place, how do you adhere to it? Well, there's a couple of pieces you're going to need in order to adhere to your budget. One is you need to have an accountability partner. Now, this might be your spouse, it might be a loved one, a relative, a friend. Doesn't matter much who it is, as long as they're a true accountability partner, somebody who is going to be able to review the budget with you and kind of say, hey, are you sure you should be spending that much in this category? And oh, by the way, it doesn't seem like you have enough to cover this particular category. Somebody who can really kind of challenge you to make sure that you're making very wise financial decisions. And then it's about meeting with that person on a regular basis. And so for those that I work with, the clients that I have that use me as an accountability partner, we meet every single time they get paid. So if there's somebody who gets paid weekly, we meet weekly. Get paid bi-weekly, we meet bi-weekly. You get the idea. So you do the same thing with your accountability partner. My wife and I, we meet the Thursday before payday. And we review the budget together. We make sure that we both kind of have signed off on everything. And then the beautiful thing about it is Friday becomes payday and execution day. And so since a budget is already mapped out, we know exactly where the money is going, then it's just a matter of paying certain bills online. So pay the mortgage online, pay the homeowners association online, pay for the car insurance online, pay whatever bills we have to online. Boom. Some bills are set up automatically on our debit card / checking account. And so we just kind of eyeball, what's going to happen over the course of the pay period. So if it's a 2-week pay period, we're looking at, okay, what's going to auto draft between now and the next time payday hits, and kind of making sure that we keep the money in the account for that. And then it's about going to the bank and withdrawing cash for anything that has a cash envelope, like our groceries, our toiletries, our baby fund, our spending money, gas, oil, and maintenance, all our cash accounts. And so that's it's just a matter of going to the bank, withdrawing the cash, and stuffing envelopes full of cash. And so those are the components that you need to adhere to a monthly budget throughout the month. So once you've written it out and you have the budget, done before the month begins. So here we are, we're in late November. It's time to sit down and write out December's budget. And then once you have it in place, it's about having an accountability partner and meeting with that accountability partner to review the month as a whole, and then to review it again just before you get paid to ensure, is this what we're really doing over the course of the next week, 2 weeks, however frequently you get paid. And then as you guys agree that yep, that's exactly what's going to happen, then payday becomes payday/execution day. And just so go pay all your bills online, leave enough in the checking account to cover auto drafts, and then go to the bank and withdraw cash to stuff in some envelopes. And it really is just that simple. And that's exactly the that's exactly the type of accountability I offer when I'm working with a client. We do exactly that. We map out a month before the month begins. We meet on or just before paydays to ensure that the budget is exactly where we want it to be. And then payday is payday/execution day, and they go off and execute. And the nice thing about that is, let's say you get paid on a Friday and you've paid all your bills, you've left enough in to cover any auto drafts, and you've already gone to the bank and you've stuffed envelopes. You don't have to worry and concern yourself with the budget again for another week or 2 weeks or however often you get paid, because you know, hey, I paid everything online, I have enough money in the bank to cover auto drafts, and oh, by the way, my cash envelopes are full, so I have enough money to go buy groceries, I have enough money to put gas in the car, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that's a helpful tip for you as to how it is that you adhere to and communicate about the budget over the course of a month.
Glynis asks, how did you focus on your wife's student loan first? What steps did you make?
All right, Glynis, this is a very appropriately timed question about the student loans, since I just addressed the fact that we're going to be putting them into deferment. But your question is, so how did we go about focusing on my wife's student loans first? And so basically, I got to take a step back to address baby step number 2 of Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover, which is the debt snowball. And it's all about listing out your debts from smallest to largest by balance owed and paying off the smallest with a vengeance. And then you take whatever money you have left over every month plus the minimum monthly payment that you were making to the smallest loan, and you roll that into the next one. I have an entire video that discusses how the debt snowball works, so go check that out. But to answer your question about how did we focus on my wife's student loans, so in baby step number 2, we broke out that particular step into 3 separate phases. The first phase was everything but the student loans. Okay, so we listed everything that was not a student loan. At the time, we had, when we started our Total Money Makeover in 2013, we had 2 auto loans. So we listed those. We had something like 16 credit cards. Thank heavens, all of them had very small balances, but we had like 16 different credit card accounts. We had a personal loan. So anything that wasn't a student loan, we listed in this first phase, and we listed it from smallest to largest. We sold some stuff, we paid off what we could, and we started closing accounts, and a lot of those credit cards didn't even have balances, so we just started closing them out. And so that was the first phase of baby step 2. Now, during that phase, both my wife's student loans and my student loans were in deferment. I was in school, she had just gotten out of school, so actually it might have been forbearance, not deferment, but essentially we made the decision that we weren't going to pay on the student loans, and we were going to use deferment and forbearance time so that we could just really focus in on the non-student loan debt and just pay it off aggressively. And so that was phase 1. Once we got out of phase 1 and paid everything off, which only took us, I don't remember exactly the amount of time, but I want to say it was between 12 and 18 months. So within a year and a half, we had everything that wasn't student loans paid off. So then we focused on phase 2, which was my wife's student loans, which is a collection of like 8 different loans that make up the big loan. So we listed those from smallest to largest. And my student loans went back into repayment at that same time. So we pay the bare minimum on my student loans, but we were paying the minimum payment on 7 out of her 8 loans, and then just the smallest one we were attacking. And once we got that, it was on to the next one. Get that, on to the next one. And so phase 2 is my wife's students' loans. And once those are paid off, then phase 3 completes our debt snowball, which is my student loans. And so that's how we broke up baby step number 2 into 3 phases so that we could focus on all the non-student loan debt first, then my wife's student loan debt, then my student loan debt. And so I hope that answers your question.
Bert asks, now that Trump is going to be president, what do you think about the housing market? Going up or down?
Hey, Bert, great question. A lot of people are probably wondering, what does a Trump presidency mean for our economy across the scale, including the housing market? And I'll tell you this, I think regardless of who is going to be the next president, there are other factors we really need to consider about where's the housing market going, because it's on fire right now. I mean, it's a seller's market. Home prices are steadily on the rise, and things are looking a lot like they did in 2006, 2007, before the housing bubble catastrophe, right? Like just the annihilation of the housing market in 2007 and 2008. And so we're seeing a lot of the same trends early on. Now, I just happen to have friends and relatives in very close to real estate and mortgages and underwriting mortgages and whatnot. And I think what we have to ask ourselves is, what type of loans are being approved, and what type of credit can individuals and families get houses with? And so if lending practices are still pretty tight and strict, and if lenders are only lending to credit-worthy individuals who have a very healthy income to debt ratio, well, then I think we're in the clear, and I think we're going to continue to see the housing market go up, regardless of whether or not the Fed raises the interest rates or not. If the Feds raise interest rates, sure, it's going to cost a little bit more to borrow the money, but it's really about the lending practices and who gets the loans and who doesn't. And so if banks are making really sound financial decisions to lend to those who are credit worthy, who have a strong income, who can pay the mortgage, and they don't get into too much house, well, then I think we're going to be okay. And I think we'll continue to see the housing market go up. However, if the banks are making unwise decisions and they're lending to people who are not creditworthy, who have shown in the past an inability to pay their bills, and they're also, so that's just one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is, if they're lending more money to people than what people can honestly and truly repay, well, then we're on the verge of another bubble that's going to burst, because we won't know until people stop making mortgage payments. If individuals and families stop making mortgage payments and start the short sale or foreclosure process, we're going to find ourselves in the same position we were 10 years ago. And so I don't have any data around what is the repayment percentage right now. Is anybody suffering from not being able to pay their mortgage, and have they stopped? And is that just, is it a very small percentage? Is it a large percentage? I have no idea. But I can tell you that that's going to be a strong indicator. A strong indicator as to whether or not we're going to be in another crisis in the housing market is whether or not people can pay their mortgage. And so that goes back to our banks lending wisely to creditworthy individuals and families who make more than enough money to cover their expenses. Or are they lending to people who have shown an inability to pay their bills on time? Or are they giving them more of a mortgage than they can really handle? And think about this, at the beginning of this episode, I told you that my regular 9 to 5 has come to an end. And so the income situation is going to look different, and it might look much, much better. It might look the same. It might look worse. And that is yet to be determined. But with the mortgage that we secured when we bought this house 6 years ago, it's $780 a month. I'm fairly certain that I could find part-time work or even full-time minimum wage work that would allow me to pay my mortgage payment. And so my mortgage payment is probably not in a whole lot of jeopardy. And I trust that God's going to provide anyway. So I trust that it's not in any jeopardy. But I'm trying to prove a point or share an example here. The other key factor in mine and my wife's situation is that my wife is a stay-at-home mother. And if I need her to go back out to the workforce, because maybe I can only find part-time work, or maybe I find full-time work, which is only minimum wage work, well, we have a second able body in the household who can go out and get work, whether it's part-time, full-time, whether it's seasonal or long-term. We have 2 able-bodied individuals to go back out into the workforce so that we can cover our mortgage. Now, what if that weren't the case? Meaning, what if I lived in a home that was $350,000, $400,000, that was the mortgage, with a payment of $2,500, $2,700 a month, and both my wife and I worked already, and we only ever got approved for that because we were both working and because we both had an income, and then one of those incomes goes away. Now you start to see the formula for, I bought too much house, I can't really afford it, I'm not going to be able to make my mortgage payment, which means I'm going to either short sale or foreclose. Probably not short sale right now, because home prices, there are very few people, I would imagine, that are currently still upside down in their house, so they could probably sell. But the more telling is, can I pay my mortgage payment? And am I willing to try to sell, or am I going to try to stay in the house, and then I can't make my mortgage payment? Now I go into default, and the bank starts the foreclosure process, and that's where it gets really scary. Is, we are blessed that we built everything off of a one income household. And so if we needed to both go back into the workforce, we could. But for people who have built everything on top of a 2-person income, and so they got houses that they could afford because 2 people were working, once one of those incomes goes away, it gets really scary. So I feel like I got off on a tangent to your question, but the bottom line is, I don't think the presidency is going to have as much of an effect on the housing market as, say, what are the lending practices. Now, the presidency could impact what regulations do or don't exist when it comes to banks lending. Now, that I don't have a whole lot of insight for you, unfortunately. I only know a little bit about what Trump's intentions and plans are for regulations around lending, and they come from a credible source, but they only come from one source. So I don't know. I can't tell you for certain what Trump's plans are for imposing new regulations or repealing regulations that are already on banks and the way that they lend. And so I would imagine that if Trump were to repeal certain regulations that kind of protect borrowers, and if banks got greedy again, well, then they probably would start lending poorly again, and to people who don't have a track record in being able to pay their bills, or giving them a mortgage that is much more than what they can truly afford. And that is going to push us into probably another housing market crisis. And so I can only imagine that if Trump actually decided to implement additional regulations that forced the banks to behave and that protected borrowers, well, then we would probably continue to see a steady increase in the housing market, because credit-worthy individuals and families who can repay their bills and who can afford the mortgages would be the types of people getting those mortgages. And so the likelihood of them being able to repay and them actually repaying and avoiding foreclosure would be significantly higher. So I would say pay attention to the regulations. Pay attention to any whispers around whether or not the foreclosure rate on houses starts to creep up. And I think those are going to be two strong indicators. Regulations and the foreclosure rate are going to be two really key indicators as to how this housing market looks in 2017 and beyond. So there you have it. Episode number 4 of the Ask Coach Nino Villa show is in the books. I want to thank Bobby, Glynis, and Bert for submitting their questions this week. Be sure to submit your question so that I can answer it on a future episode.